Our true story begins in the year 1940 with Elizabeth Phillips, who lived with her mother and younger siblings in a house that was more than 70 years old. Due to the effects of time, the paint began to fall off, and the ceilings and walls started to crack. Elizabeth found herself facing a huge expense for repairs, so she decided to rent it out for a small amount and live with her family in another house. Indeed, Elizabeth and her family moved to another house. However, after a month, Elizabeth's mother experienced her first heart attack, despite her previously enviable health. From the first heart attack, the mother's condition deteriorated day by day until she was unable to carry out her daily routine, staying in her room without ever leaving it. Days passed while Elizabeth cared for her mother, until one day, while Elizabeth was helping her mother in the bathtub, her mother had a second heart attack that instantly killed her. Elizabeth couldn't save her, and the doctors confirmed she would have died inevitably. Elizabeth and her siblings were deeply saddened by their mother's death. After a while, Elizabeth began to sort through her mother's things to distribute them among her and her siblings for the inheritance. The old house became Elizabeth's property, who would also be the guardian of her siblings. She decided to return to the old house with her siblings to renovate it with the money their mother had left them, also to save on the rent of the new house. Elizabeth and her siblings agreed on the decision and returned to the house which the renting family had left about a month ago. But as soon as Elizabeth and her siblings stepped into the old house, the water in all the bathrooms burst out, forcing Elizabeth to call a group of plumbers before the water flooded the house. Elizabeth and her siblings had to sleep together in one room until the workers finished the repairs. The plumbing workers spent the entire day fixing the issue and agreed to come back the next day, so Elizabeth went to sleep with her siblings after a tiring day. In the middle of the night, Elizabeth got up to go to the bathroom, but suddenly found the rug there, cut into letters spelling leave. Shocked, Elizabeth took 2 steps back, not believing what she saw, and suddenly noticed a strange figure standing in the mirror. She quickly looked behind her, but found no one, collapsed, and hurried back to her room, pondering what had happened. Elizabeth decided not to tell her siblings about the incident to avoid frightening them, and resolved to watch the workers to see if any of them were playing a prank on her. However, after the workers left, several of her siblings used the bathroom, and no one saw anything. Days passed, and the workers finished renovating the house simply, yet Elizabeth spent over $800 feeling sad, and each of her siblings returned to their room while she decided to stay in her mother's room, which was the only room in the house that renters were not allowed to enter. Elizabeth opened the room with difficulty, and as soon as she entered, she smelled a strange, musty, fungal odor. Elizabeth guessed there might be a dead animal in the room and started cleaning, but she found nothing. Curiosity drove her to continue searching through her mother's belongings, which had not been moved to the new house, until she suddenly found a photo of herself as a baby with her mother and a man standing next to them whom she did not recognize. Elizabeth was puzzled and read what was written on the back of the photo, finding it addressed to "My dear husband Jefferson." Elizabeth was surprised how this man could be her mother's husband, and in the same photo, even though she remembered her father as being a completely different person. Elizabeth started to recall memories from the first years of her life until she remembered vague memories of the same man, realizing her mother had hidden the truth about her real father from her, but she didn't understand why or where her real father might be now. Driven by curiosity, Elizabeth searched her mother's room until she found an old book that was clearly her mother's diary from its title. She started reading it to discover that her mother had been married to Jefferson, who was a very poor man with whom she had lived the hardest days of her life until she decided to change her life with her own hands. At that time, she began practicing black magic with the help of her African neighbor, but she was required to get rid of her husband. Then, she would become wealthy and meet the man of her dreams. Elizabeth was shocked as she continued reading the diary, and before she could turn the page, she felt a strong blow to her chest, as if someone had kicked her. She fell to the ground, screaming and unable to move from the pain. Suddenly, she saw pipe smoke coming from an invisible person toward the mirror, and with each puff, the letters G-O appeared, spelling go again. Elizabeth collapsed from terror and quickly left the room. Before she closed the door, she felt a strong wind slamming the door shut, as if it was chasing her out. Elizabeth had to choose another room, pondering what she had seen, until she remembered her mother, who used to smoke a pipe while standing in front of the mirror and liked to draw her breaths there. Elizabeth wondered if it could be her mother's spirit. She decided to re-enter the room to continue reading the diary, or even to take it with her. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by the voice of her younger brother screaming. Elizabeth ran to him and asked what happened. He told her he heard their mother's voice coming down with a cup and the plate that shakes at the stairs. Elizabeth tried to reassure him, remembering their mother, who had the habit of preparing her cup and coming down the stairs with it, and because of the trembler in her hands, they would hear the sound of the plates. Elizabeth pondered for a moment until she thought of Jefferson, her real father, and looked at her younger siblings, wondering about the age difference between them. She thought about how she had never noticed something like this before and became certain that her siblings were not from the same father. Elizabeth's curiosity about what happened to her mother increased. After putting her younger brother to sleep, she decided to return to her mother's room. Before she could open the door, she felt something wrapping around her hand, tightly like a snake. Elizabeth tried to pull her hand away in astonishment, but the invisible force continued to press on her to the point that she felt her veins might burst. Finally, Elizabeth managed to pull her hand away and decided to enter the room on another day. The next day, Elizabeth decided to go to the public library to read more about the black magic her mother had used. Upon reaching the library, she started looking for books on magic until she found one discussing it. Elizabeth opened the book and quickly scanned the titles until she came across a section titled Protecting Secrets. It said that a sorcerer can protect their secrets through certain rituals by summoning demonic entities to guard them. Elizabeth read further and learned that protection could also be achieved through intimidation tactics, which could be harmful but not to the extent of causing death. She understood why she had been experiencing those events in the room. She began to look for a way to nullify the protection until she found one and learned that if she succeeded in burning a specific type of incense in the room, she could protect herself from harm, although it was not at all easy. Elizabeth was glad she found a way and quickly inquired about the same type of incense. However, she found that the sellers of this type of incense looked at her strangely. Elizabeth didn't care and hurried back home. As soon as she knocked on the door, 3 of her siblings pulled her inside, screaming because their 4th sibling was trapped in their mother's room. Shocked, Elizabeth ran to the room and tried to open it, but the closer she got, the more she felt a burning heat. So Elizabeth decided to use the incense she had with her. She started to light the fire, but every time she did, it extinguished in front of her eyes despite there being no source of wind. Elizabeth continued her attempts until she noticed her brother screaming in agony with each attempt, unable to explain or speak from the pain. Soon, light smoke began to seep through the door cracks, smelling like burning flesh. Elizabeth panicked until she remembered something she had read in the book. The means of protection could be the same as the means to break it. She brought the fire close to the hot doorknob, and suddenly, the door opened. Elizabeth saw her brother with his face against the wall and 2 letters carved into his skin on his back, G.O. Elizabeth collapsed, screaming loudly, asking why her mother would do this to her son. She quickly took her younger brother to the hospital to treat his wounds, then returned home, saddened and pondering what could happen to her siblings again. She instructed them never to approach or enter their mother's room, no matter what happened. Time passed as Elizabeth herself tried to stay away from her mother's room, fighting her own curiosity. One day, while sitting with her siblings, they suddenly heard a noise upstairs, specifically in their mother's room. Elizabeth asked her siblings if they had let the cats inside. She quickly went to check the room and found it in disarray, with the mirror that had been hanging on the wall lying on the floor unbroken, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. Elizabeth pondered the reason behind this occurrence, whether her mother did not want her to enter the room or if it was an invitation to do so. She asked her siblings to leave the room, took the incense, and entered to continue reading the diary. Elizabeth opened the page she was on and resumed reading her mother's words, which stated that when she heard from the African woman, the only way to improve her life involved getting rid of her husband by trapping him in a room, depriving him of food and water after cutting out his tongue so that spirits could fully utilize his body and soul, fulfilling her wishes. Elizabeth continued reading the diary, shocked until she glimpsed the figure of a very thin person standing at the door. Calmly, Elizabeth moved her eyes towards him until she looked into his eyes, and suddenly, the figure opened its mouth to show a half-cut tongue. Elizabeth quickly closed her eyes, screaming, and threw the book out of her hands. After a few seconds, she calmly opened her eyes, found nothing around her, quickly picked up the diary before the incense ran out, and continued with her mother's words. Her mother had hesitated a lot, but wished for her daughter Elizabeth to have a better life than hers, and made her decision. The first step was to drug her husband with the help of her African neighbor, who then cut the unconscious man's tongue. Afterwards, they locked the windows and doors to ensure he could never escape. Hours later, Jefferson woke up to find himself trapped and unable to speak. He banged on the doors and windows, but no one heard him. He survived in this state for 20 days until he died from lack of food and water. When the African friend and the mother entered the room, they found Jefferson dead with a black magic book in his hand, open to a page titled "Live Forever with Your Loved Ones." The African neighbor was shocked to find the book open on that page and explained its meaning. She would be trapped in the house forever, and if she ever thought of leaving, she would die. The mother concluded her diary by stating that the magic had backfired and she could never live the life she desired. She accepted her fate, decided to marry, and live in the same house she would be trapped in forever. However, fearing that her children might discover her secret, she decided to protect the room so that the truth would never be discovered. Elizabeth finished reading her mother's diary with another photo of her mother and her real father. She felt profound sadness and shock at her mother, who had killed her father with her own hands. Suddenly, Elizabeth felt a chill, as if the temperature had dropped, and she heard a heavy breath behind her. The television turned on to her mother's favorite channel. Elizabeth left the room after noticing that the incense she had with her had run out. She left feeling ashamed of her mother and decided to visit her neighbor to inquire about her mother's friend. She learned that the friend had died and only her daughter remained. Elizabeth decided not to say anything, but the daughter stopped her, saying she knew what Elizabeth wanted and advised her to demolish the house to rid it of its curse forever. Elizabeth listened to the daughter's advice, left quietly, and decided to offer the house to a construction company to have it demolished and rebuilt. Eventually, Elizabeth freed herself from the house. However, months later, she received a summons from the police station to inquire about a body they found buried under the house, consisting of human bones. Elizabeth recognized the clothing buried with the skeleton and pulled out a photo of her father with her mother to hand over to the police. She then left the town and decided never to return again, and the story ended.